Welcome to Ad Hoc, all the production values of an elementary school student film. Today, as promised, we're going to talk about something that's going to put most of you to sleep. So if you've got some sort of insomnia disorder, put this in your earbuds, drift off into that gentle rest, and possibly never wake up. For the rest of you, it's copyright, so click away if you want, or continue to watch. I can't stop you. So today we're going to go over some of the basics of copyright, what it is, what it isn't, and what YouTube thinks it is, which more often resembles what it isn't than what it actually is. A little bit of background. I am an attorney, and I am actually somewhat experienced in copyright. I've written multiple articles about intellectual property in terms of enforcement, in terms of what is covered and what is not. I co-authored an amicus brief that went to the Supreme Court of the United States about copyright. I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, so don't at me, okay? We're going to talk about some things you probably think are true for copyright, and we're going to talk about some things that you think are true for copyright that are super 100% lies told to you by people who have no idea what the heck they're talking about. So if that hasn't scared you off or made you start typing death threats into the comments already, let's get started. We're going to start with a brief history of copyright, which also includes a basic primer of what is copyright. First thing people get wrong on the internet, the difference between copyright, trademark, and patents. Okay? Copyright is literally the right to copy. It's right there in the name, exactly what it says on the tin. Prior to one of the laws we're going to talk about in a minute, there was no right to reproduce vested in an author. It was only when acts were passed protecting that right that we began to talk about a copyright that existed beyond the rights that were originally given to publishers and stationers' guilds. So in the early days, that's who had any of the rights vested in a book, the people that published it. So very quickly, copyright is the right to reproduce or create derivative works of a creative work. Okay, we're going to talk about things that are creative works, books, plays, musicals, YouTube videos starring rakish lawyers talking directly into a camera this time instead of looking away a lot. What they're not are anything else that you hear referred to as the broad category of intellectual property. Okay, so in the big three of intellectual property, you have copyright for creative works, you have trademarks for branding, and you have patents for inventing. So if somebody talks about, say, McDonald's having a copyright in the phrase Big Mac, that's not right. What they mean is that McDonald's has trademarked the phrase Big Mac, and inexpertly at that, since the European court said they didn't actually have a trademark in it. If someone claims that they have a copyright or a trademark in their invention, that's not right. Inventions are patented or are covered under trade secrets, the ninja little brother of the big three that we don't like to talk about, because if you talk about a trade secret, it's no longer a trade secret. But so for copyright, we are specifically talking about creative works. And in the 18th century, when we're seeing the rise of copyrights as something that exists with an author rather than a publisher, that means books and plays. Before 1790, there was not a copyright that was held by an author. In 1790, the Statute of Anne was passed, saying, hey, maybe the person who writes a book or writes a play should have some control over what happens with it, rather than the people who have the big fancy machines that put ink on paper and spit it out into the world. The Statute of Anne established a copyright in the author, or held by the author, and set a term for that copyright. And that term was 14 years, with one renewable term of 14 years. And that was it for the United Kingdom. Now, 1790, you'll notice, a little bit after our, I need to go back and correct what I just said, because I can't read my own handwriting. 1710 is the Statute of Anne. Very small writing on a piece of paper very far away. 1790, the American experiment has begun, and we have a clause in our newly passed Constitution in 1789 that says Congress shall make laws protecting essentially patents and copyrights. Useful articles is what one of the things that it says in the Copyright Clause. And so in 1790, one of the very early things that the new Congress does is pass the Copyright Act of 1790. That's where I was getting my 1700s confused. Statute of Anne 1710, Copyright Act of 1790, enacting the Copyright Clause in the Constitution. And the Copyright Act of 1790 gives the exact same terms as the Statute of Anne. A 14-year initial term followed by a renewal term of 14 years. And notable, in both the case of the Statute of Anne and the Copyright Act of 1790, after 28 years, it's in the public domain. That's a very short amount of time for some of the times that we're about to see. That stays almost unchanged. There are some minor changes, some lengthenings, and we start getting into copyright registrations. But for the most part, that idea of a very limited amount of time that you get for a copyright continues until the Copyright Act of 1976. Copyright Act of 1976, very imaginatively named, extends the term of the copyright to either 75 years or the life of the author plus 50 years, depending on what kind of copyright you're talking about, because we set different amounts of time for a work of corporate authorship, where it is a corporation and thus not a living being that is creating a creative work, and for a creative work created by a living person who has a life who will die. If we set it at the life of a corporation, it would be immortal. Copyright would last forever. But if you have a person, obviously it's easier to tie that into how long does that person live, and maybe we should let their children derive some profit and benefit from their work as well, since we do let children inherit other forms of wealth and property. That lasted much less time because it was in 1988 that the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act was passed that changed it to either 120 years or life of the author plus 70 years. You see this referred to as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act because it was basically passed because Disney was concerned that some of their works, the early Mickey Mouse works specifically, were going to be entering the public domain, and they did not want that to happen. Sonny Bono, senator from California, yes, that's Sonny Bono of Sonny and Cher. If you are old enough to know who Sonny and Cher are, but not to remember that he was also a senator, and if you have no idea who these people are, definitely don't tell me that because I will feel a billion years old. But Sonny Bono of Sonny and Cher, who at that time was a senator from California, representing his constituents' interests, passes this act which extends it. And that's where we stay to this day, where for most of the things that we're discussing, it is the life of the author plus 70 years, unless it is a corporate creation and the corporation owns from its birth the copyright, at which point it is 120 years. That brings us then to, now that we know the history, why? Why do we do copyright? Why do we do intellectual property? Why do we have these things? The basic philosophy of intellectual property is that it is important. Lots of dead air while I was coming up with the word important. It is important to allow people that create or invent protections over their ideas the same way we allow for protections over tangible property. That just because something is in the mind, that just because someone's creation cannot necessarily be held in physical form, when you hold a DVD of Star Wars, you are not holding the idea of Star Wars, that we shouldn't protect it. Intellectual property is founded on the idea that even intangible property should have protections on it so that the person who had the idea to create it, the genius behind it, can profit from it and can derive their livelihood from it. Because otherwise, there is nothing stopping someone from copying Harry Potter and selling it without J.K. Rowling getting a dime for it. And we decided a long time ago that's how this should work. It's worth noting it's not necessarily how it has worked in the rest of the world. Before intellectual trade, there are ideas in the rest of the world about how ideas should become community property much, much faster. There's several journal articles talking about the culture of intellectual property as it existed in China and Japan, for example, before those countries came into international trade and started signing on to international treaties like the trade-related aspects of intellectual property treaty, the TRIPS treaty, or the World Intellectual Property Organization. And they had a very different foundation. But in the European Anglo-American concept, we have decided a person should be able to derive a profit and a living off of these things. Intellectual property is also founded on the idea that the greater amount of protection that we are going to give you, the less amount of time we're going to give you. Patents are ironclad, mostly. Where if you have a patent on, say, a new kind of machine, right? If you patent a 3D copier, you get a set term with a renewal, but I believe, and I'm a copyright attorney, not a patent attorney, so don't start your filings without double checking this, it's 20 years and 20 years, right? You get much less time because patents are so much more ironclad in their protection. If you get a patent and someone else reverse engineers your 3D copier, they can't use it. That's a violation of your patent. If they discover the exact same process truly, independently, without knowing about your machine, if you have a patent on it, they can't use it because it violates your patent. The only thing that can happen is they can come up with another machine that achieves the same things through different non-patented mechanisms, or they license yours. But because patent is so powerful, we give it much less time that we're willing to protect it. Trademark, conversely, because trademark is such a loosey-goosey protection, in that trademarks are only for one field of industry per registration. Trademarks must be vigorously maintained or you can lose them. Just ask the Murphy Bed Company. And if you don't know what that is, again, Google it and don't tell us how young you are. But you can lose it if you are not vigorously defending it, and your term can become the generic for the industry. Because those are so loose, and it is relatively easy to lose a trademark through no fault of your own besides lack of going after people, trademarks can essentially last forever. Think about how long Coca-Cola or Dr. Pepper have been trademarked, or IBM, International Business Machines. We have companies in America that have been trademarked for a very, very long time. Copyright sits somewhere in the middle. It has strong protections, but not ironclad protections. As we're about to talk about, you can get around copyright if you are sufficiently creative in how you transform it. So we give moderate protections for what used to be a moderate amount of time. And one of the big things that you see argued in terms of copyright is how reasonable is the amount of time that we're giving. As we just talked about, there was a long period where it was a lot less than it is now. And at the beginning of the country, it wasn't even believed that the life of the author was the amount of time. It was no more than 28 years. Now we have a term of life plus 70, which means as we get older, we're talking, if you write your first book at 20 and you live to be 90, you're looking at 140 years total on your copyright. There's a lot of disagreement about whether that's the right answer or not. But that's a matter of philosophy, of policy, of another video. Now we have kind of the basics of the history of copyright and the philosophy of copyright. Let's talk about some copyright specifics. As we said, the term of a copyright in the United States as of today in the year of our timeline, 2019, is the life of the author plus 70 years. So, as we said, however long you think you're going to live, if you write a novel today, add 70 years to that, and that's the term. Copyright applies from the moment you write it. You do not have to register copyrights in America. This has been true since 1989, when the United States signed on to the Berne Convention, which is the worldwide copyright convention, which the rest of the world decided was a good idea in 1889, and we decided to wait 100 years for because we're stubborn. As of 1989, you no longer have to do anything to have a copyright, which is why you may have heard people telling you things like, oh, well, you need to register it, or, oh, put your copyright in an, your idea in an envelope and mail it to yourself, and now you're protected. Well, the first one is no longer true, and the second one was never true. It was only a method of dating when you had the idea, which is not the same as registering. I say it's not true that you have to register, except the Supreme Court just came out with a case that precluded the seeking of certain kinds of damages based on it not being a registered copyright, which kind of undermines the Berne Convention that says that a copyright is granted the moment something is fixed in a tangible medium of expression. This is an evolving issue. Obviously, we'll need to see how they differentiate in future cases. I will put that case in the description below for people who really want to get into it. But suffice to say that right now in the United States, you have a copyright the moment you record a video, write a play, write a novel, record your song. The moment it is fixed in whatever medium it is normally fixed in, except you still might want to register it so you can get certain kinds of damages. Where people get into trouble, where we start to have internet fights, where all of the rest of it comes from, is how we protect, how we use, how we remix ideas under copyright. You, if you are on the internet, have probably heard of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Or, if you haven't heard of it, you have heard of copyright strikes. A copyright strike is an act, is YouTube telling you you've been a very naughty boy and you can't upload any more videos because you put the entire Game of Thrones Season 8 on YouTube. Or YouTube telling you you've been a very naughty boy and you can't upload videos for a little bit because you used a song someone claimed was copyrighted, and YouTube doesn't investigate and just takes down your video, except it wasn't copyrighted, and they had no right to do that, and what the what. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act is an act that modifies the Copyright Act of 1976, the CTEA of 1988, to try to bring some copyright protection to the lawlessness of the intertubes. It essentially says that content hosts will be responsible for copyright infringement by people using those sites unless the host provides a method by which copyright holders can request infringing material to be removed. This is called the safe harbor provision. YouTube's reporting system and the algorithm and all of the crap that it does, sorry YouTube, please don't take me down, all of the crap that it does are designed to satisfy the DMCA safe harbor provision by providing copyright holders a method by which they can say, hey, ad hoc stole my music and you shouldn't let them do that. If they don't have this, they will be held personally, as a corporation, responsible for those copyright violations, right? So that's why YouTube and most other content hosts are, their philosophies are so draconian. Their procedures are, oh, there was a report, we're taking it down immediately, and then the person can appeal it. Because they are doing everything they can to make sure they don't step one toe out of line of that safe harbor provision so that they don't get sued out of existence. YouTube and other platforms are not incentivized to take a wait and see or even take an investigatory approach toward takedowns. They are incentivized by the DMCA to say, look, we took it down. As soon as somebody said something, we took it down and it's gone. And then allow a process by which someone can say, well, wait, but that's my song. I had the proper licenses for it. They don't even own it. Why are you doing this? Another big part of the specifics of copyright that people come up with, or that people discuss, or that people put in front of their videos, is fair use, right? You'll notice I don't put any kind of disclaimer, any kind of fair use disclaimer on my videos. Partially because I don't know how to put clips from Game of Thrones in my videos. That's beyond me. But also partially because they're meaningless. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, fair use. Fair use is a defense to copyright. Or excuse me, to copyright infringement. It is a policy that says that while we are giving you these copyright protections, we are also recognizing that we live in the culture that we live in. And that people that are putting things out into the culture cannot completely control the ways in which they are discussed, the ways in which they are commented on, the ways in which they are remixed. For every person creating movies, we have to allow that there will be a person that wants to comment on movies, right? If we're going to allow Disney, it's only fair that we also allow Lindsay Ellis to talk about Disney. I love you, Lindsay. Please comment on my videos. So we created fair use as a way for people to be able to say, no, I'm not infringing. I'm using it fairly. One of the things I like about copyright is that so many of the things are labeled exactly what they are. Copyright is the literal right to copy. Fair use is literally saying, I am using this fairly. But fair use is not a magic get out of jail free card. Fair use is an affirmative defense. I'm really saying my ands weirdly in this video. An affirmative defense is exactly what it sounds like. It's a defense that you have to affirmatively assert. That means you cannot claim something is fair use before it has been claimed that it's infringing. I mean, you can claim it, but it has no legal force. Fair use is what you say when you are dragged into court by Disney or by Marvel, which is also Disney, or by Sony, which is also now kind of Disney. Hey, Disney. And they say you infringed our copyright. That's when you say, no, I used it fairly under the fair use doctrine, and the court decides. Let me repeat that. Fair use, whether something is fair use or not, is decided by a court. It is not decided by you when you put a disclaimer on your video. It is not decided by someone you ask before you put up a video using other people's videos. That's you saying, I think if sued and brought into a federal district court, I will prevail on the merits of a fair use affirmative defense. Fair use has 4 factors, and we don't need to get into all of them because there's one that's kind of super important. Broadly, when they are determining whether something is fair use, a court will look at the amount of the material used. They will look at whether it was for a commercial or non-commercial use. They will look at the effect on the market. And they will look at the transformative value of the new work. That last one, transformation, is the 800-pound gorilla in the locker room, if I'm going to mix my metaphors. Because a couple circuits have decided that the other factors don't matter. All that matters is transformative. And if it is sufficiently transformative, it is okay. And if it's not, it's not. Other circuits have said, no, it's a 4-factor test. We need to employ all 4 factors. No, 1 factor is more important. The case saying transformative is the most important is Carey U v. Prince, Again, I'll throw a link down below to the decision if you are supremely bored and want to read it yourself. So, the only other thing to really talk about in the specifics of what copyright is, before we get into the YouTube myths, is that copyright also covers derivative works. A derivative work is anything that is derived from the original. A spin-off, a remix, a sequel series starring a minor character that, grew to be incredibly popular. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is a derivative work of Iron Man and the Avengers. Sherlock is a derivative work of the Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, as is Elementary. Both of those derive from the original source material. They would not exist but for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's works. As long as they still have a copyright, an author controls derivative works. George R.R. Martin licensed the Song of Ice and Fire universe to HBO so that the creators of the TV show can create the TV show. They are now going to launch 3 million spin-offs because HBO knows which side, who butters its bread, and they want to keep that money train going. But they're not allowed to do that, depending on the terms of the contract, without George R.R. Martin's approval. Just because he gave approval for the TV show to be filmed does not mean that he also gave them permission to do everything, unless his contract says so. But barring that, he has the right to say, no, you done goofed on season 8 and I no longer trust you to make any more, unless he's contractually obligated. So now we're getting to the fun stuff. What are some of the most common myths that we have seen on YouTube? What are the things that make me scream into my pillow at night as I try to escape the void of terrible copyright ideas on YouTube? Number one, as we talked about, your disclaimer does not mean crap. You can put up whatever disclaimer you want before your video. It is legally inoperative. Fair use is not determined by a disclaimer, and you cannot disclaim the rights of the third-party copyright holder just because you put something in your video. What that has the effect of doing is basically saying, I think this is fair use. I hope this is fair use. Dear CBS, ABC, Disney, God, Jesus, Buddha, whoever's suing me, please don't sue me. I intended this as fair use. It is a declaration of intent rather than a legally operative phrase. In terms of legal efficiency, it is no more legally efficient than when you see it going around Facebook. I do not give Facebook the right to access my private data under the UCC and the Rome Statute. FYI, that's bullcrap too, so don't do that either. It similarly drives me crazy. No one's disclaimer has ever stopped them from getting sued. All it can do is provide to the court your belief that at the time you posted it, it was covered under fair use. That might keep you from hitting some of the damage multipliers for willful infringement. It will not stop you from being found infringing. What will stop you from being found to have infringed is following the fair use guidelines as best you can. I'm going to say, kind of lump the next several ones under the general header of, I only did X, so it's okay. You see this one a lot, not just on YouTube, but in artists' alleys at conventions, or people selling art online or posting art online. I only used 20% of their material. I only used, I only sold my work for $1, or I only sold it for under $10, or I sold less than $1,000 total. Therefore, it is not copyright infringement. None of those are true. you are infringing the copyright no matter what percent you are using of their work. You'll see people talk about, oh, well, I modified this 20%, so it's okay. No, no. One, how do you decide what's 20% of something? You know, if it's artwork, is changing Wolverine to pink costume changing 20%? Is changing his name to Logan with a U 20%? There's 5 letters there. You're changing 1 letter. That's 20%, right? No. Similarly, it doesn't matter if you are an artist selling pictures of Pikachu Deadpool. It doesn't matter if you're selling them for $1, $10, or $1,000, and it doesn't matter if you aggregate $50, $100, or $10 million. All that's changing is the damages that you have done, and partially the argument, if you're arguing fair use, of the amount of the work taken and economic or non-economic use, right? But if you're selling it at Artist's Alley, you're selling it. You are making money. You are there to make money, to make a living selling pictures of Pikachu Deadpool doing unspeakable things to Logan Jigglypuff. You can't argue that's not an economic use, right? So many of these other myths are basically saying, oh, well, it's okay if I only take a little bit. It's okay if I only take X percent or make X dollars. And that's not how the law was written. And I'm not going to argue, you know, in this video, I'm not going to argue whether or not it's good or bad the way we have set up our copyright. But what I tell people is to think about how much money could someone make off of your ideas and you would be okay with it. And the answer is probably not a single penny. But ad hoc, you might be saying, then why do artists' alleys at conventions exist? They exist because there is a tension between corporations wanting people to remember their characters and keep their characters in mind and, you know, really enjoy seeing those unspeakable things Deadpool Pikachu does, but not wanting them to get too big or make too much money, because then that's money that you could be spending buying officially licensed Pikachu products, officially licensed Deadpool products, and swapping their costumes. A lot of the decision on a big company whether or not to sue for copyright infringement comes down to how much money are they making. Very famously on YouTube, and even backed within my own household, Star Trek Axanar was the first, to the best of my knowledge, Star Trek fan film that CBS Paramount sued, and they did it because Axanar raised $1 million on GoFundMe, Kickstarter, that kind of thing. $1 million starts to be real people money to corporations in a way that, you know, the Star Trek fan films that raise $5,000 to make a 45-minute movie aren't real people money to them. It's also about how much you are trying to muscle in on their territory. Axanar had the problem of claiming it was going to make Star Trek better than Star Trek. Well, guess what? Real people Star Trek doesn't like it when you say, you suck, we're better with your playground. There are lots of things that people on the internet say wrong about copyright. I covered my mouth there. This is really terrible YouTubing. There are lots of things that people say wrong about copyright on YouTube. I cannot possibly cover them all, and this video has already run super long. I hope you enjoyed the basics. I hope you enjoyed a discussion of why copyright disclaimers before videos drive me crazy, and why videos talking about how, oh, this lawyer friend I talked to said it was fine, drive me crazy. But if you want to know more, in the comments below, please list copyright myths you've heard. I will try to knock down some of them. If there's enough response, I can do a video getting back to some of them. But in the meantime, this has been Ad Hoc. Insert funny sign off here. Have a good night.